On the morning of the 4th of July, 1918, an Australian general sat in a chateau northeast of Amiens with a plan he had spent 6 weeks building to 90-minute precision. He had 628 guns, 60 tanks, 85 aircraft, and approximately 7,000 infantry. He had 133 agenda items settled, 250 officers briefed, and a timeline calculated to the movement of a creeping artillery barrage across 2.5 kilometers of French farmland. He had also, in the preceding 48 hours, survived an attempt by 2 of Australia's most powerful journalists to have him removed from command, endured a prime minister arriving at his headquarters to consider his replacement, and watched an American general order the withdrawal of half the troops he had been promised, with 12 hours remaining before zero. Some of those Americans refused to leave. 2 of them put on Australian uniforms. Tell me in the comments, have you heard of the Battle of Hamel before today? Because if you haven't, that is the first thing this story needs to explain. Stay with this until the end, because what happened on the 4th of July, 1918, rewrote how wars are fought, and it happened despite almost everything that should have supported it first trying to stop it. To understand why a Jewish engineer from Melbourne found himself defending his right to command a battle he had already planned, you first have to understand what 4 years of industrialized slaughter had done to the armies fighting it, and what the winter of 1917 had done to the arithmetic of the war. In November of 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution brought Russia out of the conflict. What this meant for the Western Front was arithmetically simple and strategically catastrophic. Germany could now transfer more than 1 million men from the Eastern Front to France. For 3 years, Germany had been fighting on 2 fronts simultaneously, dividing resources between East and West, unable to concentrate fully against either. That constraint was gone. The German High Command had a window, narrow and closing, as American reinforcements arrived in increasing numbers, in which to end the war before the balance tipped irrevocably against them. Operation Michael, the German spring offensive, began in March of 1918. Its objective was Amiens, the critical rail junction through which the British and French armies were supplied, connected, and coordinated. If Amiens fell, the 2 Allied armies would be severed along the Somme River, each fighting a separate war it might separately lose. The advance came closer to succeeding than Allied accounts have sometimes been comfortable acknowledging. British lines buckled and in places broke. By early April, German forces had pushed to within 20 kilometers of Amiens, capturing territory the Allied armies had spent 2 years and hundreds of thousands of lives attempting to hold. The advance was checked at Villers-Bretonneux, where Australian brigades mounted a night counterattack that retook the town. But checked was not reversed. When the spring offensive consolidated, the Germans occupied a ridge northeast of Villers-Bretonneux, above the French village of Le Hamel. The ridge commanded sight lines across the Allied rear. From those heights, German artillery observers could see everything that moved on the roads and rail lines feeding Amiens, every supply convoy, every reinforcement column, every artillery battery attempting to relocate. The ridge was, in effect, a spotter platform watching the entire Allied logistical system, and the Australians defending east of Amiens could do nothing about it except absorb the fire it directed onto them. The cost of those weeks to the Australian Corps had been approximately 15,000 casualties. The second Australian conscription referendum had failed in December of 1917, meaning there was no compulsory mechanism for replacing them. Unlike the British Army, which had introduced the Military Service Act in 1916 and could legally draft men, the Australian Imperial force was composed entirely of volunteers. The Corps was bleeding from a wound it could not legislate closed. The men who remained were experienced, veterans of Gallipoli, Pozières, Messines, Passchendaele, but there were fewer of them with each passing month, and no guaranteed pipeline of reinforcements behind them. Into this situation, the Americans were arriving. From May of 1918 onward, American troops reached France at accelerating rates. June alone saw 41,000 arrive. They were untested, eager, and politically complicated in ways that would become clear in July. They were also, for an Australian corps running short of men, potentially the difference between planning an offensive and being unable to staff one. That calculation was in the mind of everyone involved when, in late June, General Henry Rawlinson, commander of the British Fourth Army, suggested to the new Australian Corps commander that American troops should join his next operation. It would give the Americans combat experience alongside battle-hardened Australians, and it would strengthen depleted Australian battalions that had lost companies to gas attacks and months of attritional fighting. The new Australian Corps commander was Lieutenant General John Monash. He had been confirmed in the role on the 1st of June, 1918, 33 days before the battle. The appointment had not been uncontested. Understanding why requires understanding who he was and what the people contesting him believed him to be. Monash was born on the 27th of June, 1865, in West Melbourne, Victoria. His parents, Louis and Bertha, were both Jewish, both from Kratoshen in the Prussian province of Posen, and both German-speaking. German was the mother tongue of the household. He grew up bilingual, received piano lessons from his mother, developed an early and lasting interest in chess and literature, attended Scotch College in Melbourne, where he was equal dux, then enrolled simultaneously in arts, law, and engineering at the University of Melbourne. He co-founded and edited the Melbourne University Review, performed publicly on piano, abandoned the combined course in 1885 when his mother died, returned, and completed all 3 degrees. His civilian career was in civil engineering, specializing in reinforced concrete construction, bridges, rail lines, large industrial structures. One business failed and left him impoverished. He rebuilt another and became wealthy. By 1912, he was a prominent Melbourne businessman, a radical president of the Victorian Institute of Engineers, and a university counselor. He had also, in parallel, been serving in the Australian militia since 1887, commanding an artillery battery, moving into intelligence work, eventually commanding the 13th Infantry Brigade as a colonel. The relationship between those 2 careers was not coincidental. Monash viewed warfare as he viewed construction, as a problem in applied engineering. Variables could be identified, quantified, and controlled. The consequences of failure could be predicted and planned around. Where other generals of his era looked at a battle as a contest of will, the side that absorbed the most punishment and continued fighting being the side that won, Monash looked at it as a problem in resource allocation. The infantry's role, as he stated it explicitly, was not to expend itself upon heroic physical effort, not to wither away under merciless machine gun fire, but to advance under the maximum possible array of mechanical resources in the form of guns, machine guns, tanks, mortars, and aeroplanes. Men were not the instrument of victory. They were the objective of planning. You used everything else so that fewer of them died. His early record in uniform had been mixed. At Gallipoli, his performance was competent, but not distinguished. And Charles Bean, the official war correspondent, whose dispatches shaped what Australians understood about the war and who was simultaneously writing the foundational, multi-volume official history, formed a low opinion of him. Bean's reasoning combined professional assessment with something else. Monash did not fit Bean's conception of the quintessential Australian character he was in the process of constructing. He was not a larrikin. He was not an instinctive soldier. He was a systematic, elaborately prepared civilian professional who happened to be Jewish, of Prussian-German parentage, and demonstrably more effective at each successive level of command than he had been at the previous one. What Bean did not yet see, and would eventually acknowledge he had failed to see, was that this last quality was the essential one. As a brigade commander at Gallipoli, Monash was adequate. As a divisional commander on the Western Front from 1916, he was formidable. The 3rd Australian Division under his command fought well at Messines, handled the preliminary stages of Passchendaele competently, and entered the defensive fighting of early 1918 as one of the most efficiently run formations in the British Expeditionary Force. By May of 1918, when he was promoted to Lieutenant General and confirmed as commander of the Australian Corps, the British High Command had been watching his progression for 2 years and had concluded it was not accidental. The appointment was not without contention. It is insufficient to say merely that it was disputed. What was assembled against Monash in the weeks before and after his confirmation constitutes one of the more remarkable episodes in the institutional history of the Australian war effort. Bean wrote in his private diary, the diary of the man writing the official history, words that require no interpretation. We do not want Australia represented by men, mainly because of their ability, natural and inborn in Jews, to push themselves forward. Of Monash specifically, he wrote separately that his ambition makes him an underground engineer, and that he has the Jewish capacity of worming silently into favor. These are not the private doubts of a man wrestling with a difficult professional judgment. Bean's co-conspirator was Keith Murdoch, the father of Rupert Murdoch, the most influential Australian journalist of the war years, with direct access to Prime Minister William Morris Hughes. Together, they lobbied Hughes against Monash's appointment, arguing that senior AIF officers broadly opposed the confirmation and that Lieutenant General Brudenell White should command the Corps instead. Hughes, en route to Europe via the United States, suspended Cabinet's approval of the appointment pending personal investigation. What they had told him was false. The divisional commanders supported Monash. Several, when they discovered what had been reported in their name, were enraged. Brudenell White, the man proposed as Monash's replacement, had neither sought the role nor encouraged the campaign conducted on his behalf. Hughes arrived at Monash's headquarters at the Chateau of Bertangle, northeast of Amiens, on the 2nd of July, 1918. 2 days before the battle, Monash was completing the final stages of planning. He consulted with divisional commanders. He found none of the opposition he had been told was widespread. He left convinced. The journalists moved on to other campaigns. Monash's letter to his wife, written 9 days before the battle, had noted the situation without drama. It is a great nuisance to have to fight a pogrom of this nature in the midst of all one's other anxieties. The other anxieties amounted to 133 agenda items, 60 tanks, 85 aircraft, 628 guns, and the most elaborately timed coordinated assault the Western Front had attempted. The plan Monash submitted to Rawlinson on the 21st of June, 1918, was a dawn attack coordinating 4 arms simultaneously: infantry, artillery, tanks, and aircraft. His original version proposed no creeping artillery barrage. Tanks alone would provide the fire support for the infantry advance. That proposal was changed at the first planning conference on the 25th of June, and the reason it was changed deserves to be stated precisely. Major General Ewan Sinclair McLagan commanded the 4th Australian Division, the primary formation for the attack. His men had been at Bullecourt in April of 1917, 14 months earlier, where tanks had been promised as the substitute for artillery support, and where 4 of the 8 tanks assigned to the 4th Brigade arrived late, disabled, or broke down. The remaining 4 encountered wire the armor was supposed to have cleared and had not. Australian infantry crossed into German machine gun fire on ground that tanks were supposed to have opened. More than 3,000 casualties. The bitterness was not sentimental. It was institutional, and it was earned in the way that all such bitterness is earned, by the men doing the dying. When Sinclair McLagan, along with Brigadier General Thomas Blamey and Brigadier General Walter Coxon, heard that the new plan also proposed replacing the artillery barrage with armor, they objected. Their reasoning was direct. Artillery was reliable. Tanks, however improved, remained experimental. The creeping barrage was restored. The tanks were moved into a supporting role. The plan that fought the battle was not the plan Monash originally submitted. It was the plan that survived contact with the memory of Bullecourt, shaped by officers whose objections were drawn from experience that no conference could manufacture. What the final plan assembled was this. The artillery program alone involved 302 heavy guns and 326 field pieces, British, French, and Australian, organized in 4 groups under their own commanders. The creeping barrage would open 200 yards ahead of the attacking infantry and move forward at 100 yards every 3 minutes, pausing for 10 minutes, halfway to allow battalions to consolidate, and the next wave to leapfrog through, then continuing at 100 yards every 4 minutes. 161 additional heavy guns were assigned exclusively to counter-battery work, targeting German artillery with a precision that would, during the battle itself, almost entirely silence the opposing guns. The total ammunition expenditure for the operation was approximately 132,000 rounds. The technical achievement that made this possible, 49 of the 61 batteries moving into position and ranging their guns in the days before the attack without firing a single ranging shot, was itself a capability that had not reliably existed earlier in the war. The 60 Mark V tanks from the British 5th Tank Brigade were, on the 4th of July, 1918, appearing in combat for the first time. Previous models had been slow, required 4 men to drive rather than 1, and were mechanically unreliable in ways Bullecourt had confirmed beyond argument. The Mark V moved as fast as a running infantryman. 1 man drove it. 4 carrier tanks were designated for a function not previously attempted in warfare, bringing rations, water, ammunition, and engineering supplies directly to forward dumps immediately after capture, removing from the infantry the burden of carrying consolidation stores across no man's land under fire. The 85 aircraft of the Royal Flying Corps and Australian Flying Corps were assigned multiple roles: direct ground attack, observation, and, for the first time in the history of armed conflict, aerial ammunition resupply. Captain Lawrence Wackett of No. 3 Squadron of the Australian Flying Corps had designed a delivery system using parachutes made from aircraft fabric tied through the handles of ammunition boxes, stored in half-oil drums in the bomb racks of RE-8 reconnaissance aircraft. The boxes could be dropped from 300 meters and land within 90 meters of their targets. Rawlinson and Monash had attended a demonstration of the system on the 24th of June. It would work. The 30th of June conference at Bertangles was, in itself, a statement of what Monash believed command required. 250 officers attended. The agenda contained 133 items. The session ran for 4 hours and 20 minutes. Every element of the plan was worked through. Every question was settled. Every officer explained their role to the officers around them. If anyone was killed before 0 hour, the officer behind them already knew the plan. Lieutenant Edgar Rule of the 4th Australian Division described the result. The men were given plans and orders. Conference followed conference, until every officer had their part understood and could take command the moment someone ahead of them could not. No battle should produce surprises that planning could have anticipated. Monash intended to anticipate all of them. Secrecy surrounding the preparations was treated as operationally equivalent to the planning itself. Written orders were limited and distributed only to officers with direct need at each stage. Movement of troops was permitted at night only. Zinc water tanks, whose glinting surfaces could be spotted from aircraft, were covered with blankets during daylight hours. Dummy installations elsewhere suggested activity in sectors other than Le Hamel. The rank-and-file soldier was told nothing of the operation until the last possible moment. The conditioning of the German defenders was the preparation that no written order could have captured and no training exercise could have simulated. For approximately 2 weeks before the battle, Monash's artillery ran a program designed not to destroy German positions, but to teach the men defending them a pattern. Every day before dawn, at 3 o'clock in the morning, aircraft strafed the German trenches, while artillery fired a mixture of gas and smoke shells simultaneously. The defenders did what professional training dictated. They retreated to their dugouts, pulled on their gas masks, and lowered their gas-proof curtains. They waited for the danger to pass. It passed. They resumed their positions. The pattern repeated the following morning, and the morning after that, for 2 weeks. Rule watched the American platoons integrating into Australian companies during this preparation period and recorded the relationship forming between the two forces. 12 Americans were placed in each platoon, and they were, Rule wrote, dead keen. The novelty of war had long since vanished for the Australians. The novelty was entirely on the American side, and the two responses produced something unexpected. The veterans became teachers, and the energy of the newcomers briefly restored something the veterans had lost. Private Charles Ebersole of Chicago recorded that the Australians were very good and very democratic, though somewhat undisciplined. The bond forming across those days of preparation would, in less than 48 hours, lead some of those Americans to choose their Australian comrades over the explicit instructions of their own commanding general. That outcome was not yet visible. Rawlinson had suggested, in late June, that including American troops from the United States 33rd Division would give them combat experience while strengthening Australian battalions depleted by months of fighting. Monash was promised 10 companies, approximately 2,000 men. On the 29th of June, Major General George Bell of the 33rd Division selected 2 companies from the 131st and 132nd Infantry Regiments of the 65th Brigade. On the 30th, the remaining companies from the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 131st Infantry Regiment joined them. Each American platoon of 60 men was reduced by 1/5 to match the 100-man Australian company structure, and each was embedded within an Australian company assigned to its sector of the assault line. The 41st Battalion, which had lost its A Company to a gas attack at Villers-Bretonneux, absorbed Americans as X Company. For the first time in the history of the United States Army, American soldiers were preparing to fight under a foreign commander in an offensive assault. Then, General John J. Pershing found out. Pershing commanded the American Expeditionary Force in France. He held one strategic principle with the consistency of a physical law. American troops would fight as an independent American army under American command, not as replacement units distributed through Allied formations. His reasoning was not irrational. He had watched the Allied armies consume men at industrial rates for 4 years, under commanders whose methods had produced the Somme and Passchendaele. He had declined every British and French request to feed American soldiers into those formations as reinforcement. The Americans would fight as Americans, when ready, under American officers. During a visit to United States II Corps headquarters on the 2nd of July, Pershing learned that 10 companies of his men had been committed to an Australian assault. He advised General Reed that the troops should not participate. The following day, he telephoned with what the record describes as further and positive instructions that the troops should be withdrawn. On the 3rd of July, 6 American companies received orders to pull back from the line. Some obeyed. Many refused. 2 men in the 42nd Battalion removed their American uniforms and put on Australian ones. Their names are not in the record. Their decision is. The consequences for the plan were surgical. The 11th Brigade shrank from 3,000 to 2,200 men. The 16th Battalion's strength was halved, Monash and his staff were required to reorganize attack formations in the hours remaining, redistributing sector responsibilities across battalions now short of the manpower planned into them. At approximately 4 o'clock in the afternoon of the 3rd of July, fewer than 12 hours before zero, a further demand arrived. All remaining American troops were to be withdrawn immediately. Monash went to Rawlinson. His argument was not strategic, it was geometrical. The 4 remaining American companies were not peripheral attachments. They were embedded as organic components of specific battalions, assigned specific sections of specific trenches along the assault line. Extracting them now meant complete reorganization of attack formations in the dark, on the eve of an operation calculated to 90-minute precision, in which every battalion's movement was timed to a creeping barrage that would not pause for a reorganization nobody had anticipated. Rawlinson supported him. Rawlinson appealed to Field Marshal Haig. Haig telephoned. He had directed the withdrawal of the Americans in deference to Pershing's wishes, he said. But as matters now stood, he wished everything to proceed as originally planned. The 4 remaining American companies would fight. Monash, writing in 1919, described what those hours had felt like. It appeared to me at the time that great issues had hung for an hour or so upon the chance of my being able to carry my point. The controlled language is characteristic. A man who had spent a professional lifetime making load calculations, describing the moment when the structure he had built came within one telephone call of being canceled. The crisis passed. The battle was on. At 10:30 in the evening of the 3rd of July, 60 Mark V and Whippet tanks began moving from Fouilloy and Hamlet to assembly areas approximately half a mile behind the front lines. Infantry guides from the attacking battalions marked tracks from those areas to the start lines. Australian infantrymen had already sent parties forward to cut paths through their own wire. The tank engines, each machine weighing approximately 28 tons, produced a sound that could not be disguised, only absorbed. Aircraft maintained their strafing runs overhead. Artillery opened its usual harassing bombardment at 3 o'clock and 2 minutes in the morning. The same time, the same sound, the same pattern as every morning for 2 weeks. In the German trenches, the conditioned response operated as designed. The defenders pulled on their gas masks, retreated to their dugouts, and lowered their gas-proof curtains. 60 tanks moved the last half-mile to the front line, covered by darkness and the noise of guns and aircraft that the men in the dugouts could hear but not act on, because they were wearing gas masks in positions built to be gas-proof. At 3:10 in the morning of the 4th of July, 1918, the main barrage began. Along 6 kilometers of French farmland, men rose from their start lines and began following the artillery at a distance of 75 yards. Gunner J.R. Armitage, positioned with the supporting artillery, wrote in his diary that the earth shook and the mind boggled at the concussion. The chalky soil churned up by the exploding shells produced clouds of dust that mixed with the smoke of the barrage, creating a moving wall of obscuration through which the infantry advanced. Lance Corporal John Stally Tilbrook of the 43rd Battalion had not gone over the top since the 4th of October, 1917, 9 months earlier. He had walked 18 miles in a single day 2 days before. He was at a tape in the dark, and then the guns opened, and then he was moving forward. The barrage was accurate. It was also, in places, not. At the junction of the 4th and 11th Brigades, some rounds fell short, virtually wiping out 1 American squad and 1 platoon of the 43rd Battalion in the first minutes. Further south, on the 15th Battalion's front, 12 men were killed and 30 wounded by similar short rounds. These were the costliest moments of the battle. They were also moments that Monash had calculated into his casualty estimate, because no artillery plan of this density across this width of front had ever been executed without some rounds falling wrong, and he had planned around that reality rather than pretending it would not occur. In the 4th Brigade sector, the advance to Vere Wood and Pear Trench began immediately against the resistance the German 55th Infantry Regiment could mount through smoke, with gas masks inhibiting vision and communication. The 16th Battalion breached the German line despite its tanks arriving late. The armor had not yet caught up with the infantry by the time the trench line was reached, and the 16th went in without it. Large numbers of Germans emerged from dugouts to find Australians already past them, already advancing. The conditioning that had trained them to shelter during the pre-dawn fire had, on this particular morning, left them below ground while the battle passed overhead. Private Henry Dalziel of the 15th Battalion was wounded during the advance toward Pear Trench. He continued. The machine gun position there was still active, still putting fire across the ground the Australian advance needed to cross. Dalziel reached it. He threw grenades. He charged with his bayonet. He killed 10 German defenders and captured 6 more. He was later awarded the Victoria Cross. At the edge of Vere Wood, Lance Corporal Thomas Axford of the 16th Battalion cleared a German trench position with the same combination, grenades then bayonet. 10 killed. 6 captured. Also the Victoria Cross. Both men had been wounded. Both continued. The after-action reports describing their actions use the language of professional military record, which does not reach for drama because the facts, stated plainly, contain enough of it. In the center, the 11th Brigade advanced on the village of Hamel itself. The 43rd Battalion, with American platoons attached, was assigned to take the village. The tanks designated to support this sector had not arrived by the time the 43rd reached its line of departure. The infantry went without armor. Some German defenders of the 202nd Reserve Infantry Regiment began withdrawing as the 43rd moved forward. Others held their positions. Elements of the 43rd outflanked the German line through the edge of Notamel Wood. Heavy fighting erupted in the confined streets of the village. One group of Australians with their attached American platoon killed 15 Germans and captured 40 more in the clearing of a single position. The 44th Battalion, following through the breach, wheeled to cover the ridge line south of the village. When the tanks finally arrived, they cleared the German trenches there with machine guns and quick-firing guns mounted in their hulls, taking large numbers of prisoners from dugouts whose occupants had been sheltering from a barrage they had not expected to be followed by armor. The 10-minute standing barrage pause arrived. The line halted, consolidated, and waited. The next wave leapfrogged through. This passage of lines maneuver, complex even in training, requiring each unit to know where the unit ahead of it was supposed to be and to advance through that position without disrupting it, had been rehearsed, briefed, and settled at the 30th of June conference. It executed. During the pause, RE-8 aircraft from No. 3 Squadron of the Australian Flying Corps began their runs over the forward positions. Parachutes of aircraft fabric opened above the smoke. Ammunition canisters descended and landed within 90 meters of their targets along the advancing line. No runners crossed no man's land under fire. It was the first time in the history of armed conflict that aircraft had been used to resupply infantry on the ground. It was noted in after-action reports without ceremony because it worked. Around Notamel Wood, initial German resistance was sustained. The positions had been sited to provide overlapping fields of fire, and they used that advantage while they could. The wood was eventually cleared through combined action, air power, artillery, and tanks moving in from the flanks. As the sun rose and darkness gave way to daylight, the British tanks could see clearly enough to work through remaining positions, firing in the confined spaces of streets and a nearby quarry, removing pockets of resistance the infantry had bypassed in the initial assault. The 43rd Battalion's war diary records the advance through the village in language that captures the controlled chaos of a plan-meeting reality. Good cover, light casualties, the barrage reliable, the tanks doing excellent work when they arrived, the machine guns giving the most trouble throughout. Tilbrook, writing to his father from the position his battalion had just taken, offered the simplest verdict available. It was the pleasure of our battalion to pass through the village of Hamel and take it. Our casualties were light. We had a magnificent barrage, and the tanks went through with us, doing excellent work. Read as a soldier's letter, it is a note home. Read as military history, it is the confirmation that everything assembled at the 30th of June conference, the 133 items, the 4-hour session, the plans for every contingency, including the absence of tanks, had produced precisely what its author calculated it would produce. At 4:43 in the morning of the 4th of July, 1918, all objectives along the 6-kilometer front were secured. Reconnaissance aircraft immediately began photographing the new front line for map-making, 3 minutes over Monash's estimated 90. The counter-battery work had been so effective that nowhere during the entire operation had the success of the assault been threatened by German artillery fire. 161 heavy guns had targeted the German positions so accurately that the defenders had been unable to respond with any significant counter-fire to the attack rolling through their lines. The German 13th Division and 43rd Reserve Division, approximately 5,000 men defending a 6-kilometer front, had been overrun in the time it takes to watch a feature film by a force attacking below the 3-to-1 ratio that conventional doctrine considered the minimum for success in a set-piece assault. What emerged from the German positions told its own story. Approximately 1,600 prisoners were taken. More than half refused to remove their gas masks even after the fighting ended, even behind Allied lines, even in the presence of captors who were clearly unaffected by any airborne agent. They had been conditioned so completely by 2 weeks of 3 o'clock in the morning smoke and gas combinations that they remained, in the immediate aftermath of their defeat, convinced that some danger persisted. They had defended a position they could not see through, hear through, or communicate through, and they had still not deduced, sitting in Allied custody, that there had never been any gas on the day of the attack. They had been defeated, in part, by a calendar. The captured material confirmed what the prisoner count suggested. 2 field guns, 179 machine guns, 32 trench mortars, and a weapon that Allied intelligence had not previously encountered, a 13mm anti-tank rifle, Germany's answer to the development of Allied armor. The Allies had been unaware it existed. It is now on display at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, preserved because that morning of coordinated warfare overran the position where it was stored. Allied losses amounted to approximately 1,400 total. Australian casualties numbered approximately 1,062. American losses were 176, of whom between 13 and 26 were killed in the main assault. The 15th Brigade's diversionary feint at Ville-sur-Ancre, north of the Somme, produced an additional 142 casualties. The preparatory work that protected the main assault's flanks, absorbed by men whose contribution was to ensure that nothing disrupted the operation to the south. Their names entered the accounting alongside the village they never entered. The following day, the 5th of July, German forces counterattacked the newly captured positions. American Corporal Thomas A. Pope of E Company, 131st Infantry Regiment, 33rd Division, attached to the 44th Battalion, and one of the men who had stayed when others left, found his company's advance halted by German machine gun fire. Pope did not halt. He rushed forward alone. He bayoneted several German gunners. He stood beside the captured weapon and held off the remaining Germans until his company could reach him. King George VI personally presented him the Distinguished Conduct Medal on the 12th of August, 1918. General Pershing, the man who had ordered his withdrawal from the front 48 hours earlier, presented him the Medal of Honor on the 22nd of April, 1919. Thomas Pope was the first American awarded the Medal of Honor in the First World War. He was also the last surviving recipient of that decoration from the war. He died in 1989 at the age of 94. 3 days after the battle, French President Georges Clemenceau visited Monash and the Australians at 4th Division headquarters. He told the assembled troops that he had come there just for the very purpose of seeing the Australians. Rawlinson, in a message that reached Prime Minister Lloyd George, described the operation as a brilliant piece of work. Monash's position as Corps commander, contested by journalists 2 days before the battle and nearly cancelled by an American general 12 hours before zero, was from the 7th of July, 1918, unassailable. Pershing wrote afterward that the battle had come as somewhat of a surprise, and that its immediate effect was to cause him to make his instructions so positive that nothing of the kind could occur again. The American captain commanding one of the 4 companies that had fought, Captain Gale, offered the assessment of the men rather than the institutions. More real good had been done by this small operation with the Australians, he said, than could have been accomplished in months of training behind the lines. The men who had refused to leave, the men who had switched uniforms, their verdict was delivered by their presence rather than their testimony. The full weight of that morning became visible only in the weeks that followed. Monash wrote in 1919 that the Hamel operation had become the model for all enterprises of a similar character, which it afterwards fell to the lot of the Corps to carry out. He was being precise rather than modest. Within weeks of the battle's conclusion, he was applying the same principles to a problem of an entirely different scale. The Battle of Amiens opened on the 8th of August, 1918. Its plan was Hamel's plan at the size of an army: coordinated infantry, artillery, tanks, and aircraft. Complete secrecy. No preliminary bombardment to preserve surprise. Every officer briefed to every element of every other officer's role. Instead of one Australian division supported by one tank brigade, Monash had the full Australian and Canadian Corps alongside Rawlinson's British formations. Instead of 60 tanks, every available armored vehicle in France, the same conductor, a larger orchestra, the same principles of preparation, coordination, and the systematic protection of infantry through the application of everything that could be brought to bear before and alongside them. German First Quartermaster General Erich Ludendorff called the 8th of August, 1918, the Black Day of the German Army in the history of the war. Allied forces advanced up to 8 miles in some sectors on the first day alone, more ground than the entire Passchendaele campaign had gained in months, at a fraction of the cost. German divisions routed. For the first time, the German High Command acknowledged to itself that the war was lost. The campaign continued through September and October. The Hindenburg Line, Germany's final strategic defensive system, the positions the German High Command believed could hold through the winter, was breached by the 5th of October, 1918. On that date, Germany requested an armistice. It arrived on the 11th of November. It would be convenient to attribute what happened between July and November entirely to Monash, and it would not be accurate. The British Journal for Military History's analysis of the Hamel battle, published in 2023, argues that the overhead Vickers machine gun suppression system, batteries of heavy machine guns operating under centralized telephone and wireless control and functioning effectively as single large weapons capable of suppressing German fire across entire brigade fronts, was as central to the battle's success as the combined arms framework Monash is usually credited with. That system had been developing in the Australian Imperial force since Gallipoli, refined through Pozières and Messines by officers whose names do not appear in the popular accounts and whose accumulated tactical learning made the 4th of July possible. Monash's contribution was synthesis and integration, seeing how all of it could function together, simultaneously, coordinated to a schedule. The history belongs to many men. the organization of it, belonged to one. On the 12th of August, 1918, 4 days after Amiens, King George IV knighted Monash in the field at Bertangle, in the same chateau from which the Prime Minister of Australia had arrived 6 weeks earlier to consider replacing him. It was the first battlefield knighthood bestowed by a British monarch in approximately 200 years. The man Bean and Murdoch had worked to remove from command in June was Sir John Monash by August. He returned to Australia on the 26th of December, 1919, after overseeing the repatriation of Australian troops from Europe with the same methodical thoroughness he had applied to deploying them. His wife Vic, who had received the pogrom letter 9 days before Hamel, died of cervical cancer on the 27th of February, 1920. He had been away for more than 4 years. He came home to this. He was appointed head of the State Electricity Commission of Victoria, charged with harnessing the state's brown coal reserves for industrial use. He built it into one of Australia's most successful state instrumentalities. He served as Vice-Chancellor of the University of Melbourne from 1923, as the spokesman for returned soldiers, and as an active Zionist and Jewish community leader. He was promoted to General, 4 stars, the highest rank in the Australian Army, in November of 1929, the first Australian to hold that rank. He died on the 8th of October, 1931. His state funeral drew approximately 250,000 people, probably the largest in Australian history to that time. He was buried with Jewish rites at Brighton Cemetery in Melbourne. Bean eventually wrote that his intervention against Monash's appointment had been high-intentioned, but ill-judged, and that those involved had acted without adequate appreciation of Monash, who, though his reputation as a frontline soldier had been poor, was nevertheless a much greater man than most of us then thought. The private diary in which he had written about the ability natural and inborn in Jews became widely known only decades later. The official history he wrote shaped Australian understanding of the war for a generation. Both things are part of the record, and the distance between them is not one that a single retrospective acknowledgement closed. The Tankewehr captured at Le Hamel, the anti-tank rifle no Allied intelligence report had previously named, stands in the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. It is the most concrete single artifact of what that morning produced, a weapon catalogued and preserved because coordinated warfare overran the position where it was stored, in a battle whose commander had spent the preceding 48 hours managing the consequences of a political conspiracy and an American general's telephone call. The Australian Corps Memorial was opened at Le Hamel on the 4th of July, 1998, the 80th anniversary, on the ridge overlooking the ground where the 43rd Battalion passed through the village, and Tilbrook noted that the barrage had been magnificent. A campaign has since argued, with sustained effort and no final resolution, that Monash should be posthumously promoted to Field Marshal. The Turnbull government confirmed in April of 2018 that no such promotion was planned. Whether the discrimination Monash faced in life was adequately acknowledged after his death remains, in the official record, open. Thomas Pope, the American corporal who rushed the German machine gun on the 5th of July, while Pershing was drafting instructions to ensure such integration would never happen again, outlived nearly everyone who made his decoration possible. He died in 1989 at 94. The Battle of Le Hamel is not in the national consciousness of Australia the way Gallipoli is in the national consciousness of Australia. A landing that failed and killed 8,700 Australians is the cornerstone of the Anzac narrative, the gravitational center of a mythology that returns to it annually without diminishing. A battle that succeeded in 93 minutes at a cost of approximately 1,062 Australian casualties is a footnote in the same account, known to historians, referenced by military scholars, the subject of a centenary book and an army memorial, but not a word that stops a room. National mythologies are not always rational about which stories they carry forward. Heroic failure travels further than decisive success. The battle site today is farmland northeast of Villers-Bretonneux, in modern northern France. The ridge overlooks the same ground the 43rd Battalion crossed in darkness on the 4th of July, 1918. The memorial stands above it. The village of Le Hamel is still there, smaller than its name suggests in the history books, quieter than its record deserves. The ground where Axford threw his grenades and Dalziel continued despite his wounds, and the American platoons advanced without orders to retreat, is, like all such ground, unremarkable to look at, and immovable in what happened on it. What makes this story different from the general record of the Western Front is not that men were brave. Both sides were brave, as both sides had been for 4 years. What makes it different is that one man looked at the slaughter those 4 years had produced and concluded that an infantryman's life was a variable to be protected by planning, not expended by heroism. That the engineers' approach to war, the approach that treated a battle as a problem in load-bearing and resource allocation, could reduce casualties, increase speed, and produce results that the traditional approach could not. He was right. He proved it. And he proved it while simultaneously managing a political conspiracy designed to remove him, a prime minister dispatched to investigate whether the conspiracy was justified, and an American general who ordered half his forces withdrawn the day before he needed them. The Tankewehr is in Canberra. The men are gone. The ground at Le Hamel is still there, the same chalk and clay that churned up under 132,000 artillery rounds on a July morning more than a century ago, growing crops now in the way that European farmland reclaims what was done on it, quietly and without ceremony. If this story deserves to be known beyond the footnotes where it has spent the last 100 years, share it with someone who hasn't heard it. The men who put on Australian uniforms and stayed don't have names in the record. Their decision is what remains. That, and the morning of the 4th of July,